All right, guys, what's up? Well, thank you so much for joining me for the Expand to Canada mini course. Really appreciate your trust and support. And honestly, I believe that this is one of the strategies that can unlock the easiest growth in your Amazon FBA business as you look to grow and expand. So I wanted to kick things off with just a really quick video, though it's important, just to walk through what to expect with the course, the structure, and most importantly, some of the documents, tools, and things that will help you as a companion to the video materials that you're going to find in the course. So let's start out with the battle plan, which can really be broken up into 4 different distinct sections. So in terms of videos, this is what you can expect. We've got a series of intro videos just to set the stage. We've got how to dive into the numbers, demand, the math of selling, pricing strategy, ROI, all of your Canada setup, logistics and ops, and then your Canada launches. So some important things in the structure: when you click on a video, if you go to the description down below, there's going to be a series of documents that you're going to find. The first of which is going to be actual copies of these presentation files. So if you want to just download the files that I'm speaking about, there's going to be links and documents to that. The second is SOPs. There's a number of different videos which require step-by-step setup. We've made that really easy with SOPs, so if there's an SOP related to the video you're watching, you can also find that in the description. Similarly, some of these videos are going to have tools, Google Sheets, documents, PDFs, etc. You can find those as well in each of the videos. And then the final thing you can expect is we've really kind of battle tested, found some winners, found some losers, and all of the partners to actually make this whole thing work. So we've done a lot of that easy testing, lost money, found the ones that work. So if there's a referral partner that we actually trust and agree with, we've also included a Rolodex of all of the partners that we recommend and you may want to use. Freight forwarding, imports, setting up your Canadian entity, accounting, 3PLs, you name it. We will call out those specific partners again in the videos and slides if they correspond to that section. And we're also going to include a Rolodex document that you can basically leverage those as you need to. And then finally, we've created a checklist, just a handful of kind of core things that you need to implement the strategy. I'm going to include that PDF down below. You can also see it here, but you can reference that as you go about implementing your Canada strategy. So thanks again for your trust. Really stoked to get into this. I really believe in this strategy. I've witnessed a lot of benefit in our business doing this. I hope that these videos help get you there. Hope this course helps elevate your Amazon business. If you've got any questions, there's also comment sections in the video. Feel free to leave those and I'll check those regularly and respond as I can. Cheers, guys. All right, so I wanted to just kick things off by showing one of our brands here that we launched in Canada. I think it was about 1.5 years ago. So just like we talked about in this course, we started on NARF. And 2022 is our first full-fledged year in Amazon FBA. So just kind of wanted to go through some of those numbers just so you guys can kind of understand some of the easy benefit that we get when we expand into Canada. So I'm just going to change the date range here to custom. And then I'm going to go back. I think we launched in NARF in like October of 2021. So I'm going to go back to October, hit apply. And you can see the total here is just north of $380,000. If we want to talk about other ways to get revenue in the Amazon game, launching new products, expanding sales channels outside of Amazon, all those things, a lot riskier than just taking existing winners and applying them into Canada. And frankly, this is some of the easiest 380 grand that I've ever made in the Amazon game because it's established products, the reviews carry over, really minimal operational lifting, and getting this kind of revenue, which I think we earned something like $90,000 on this 380 grand. Is why I believe that expanding into Canada is such a benefit. So you can kind of see how we ramped up here. We weren't doing very much on NARF. I think we plugged it in October, a couple $100 a day. Then I think in January of 2022 is when we kind of first really started to ship inventory in. We slowly started to expand our catalog, kind of doing, I don't know, 500 to 1,000 a day. We had some spikes during Prime Day here. And then as we ramped into Q4, we started to see some bigger numbers. And then you can see it at its peak, we were doing $5,000 a day. So again, we're going to get into the benefits of this in the course. We're going to get into how to execute it, but I just wanted to illuminate some of the opportunity that we've seen in our business as we've implemented exactly what we're going to talk about in this course. So the purpose of this video is basically just to build on the why global, why go international video that we just went over in the previous video. And more specifically, why I think that Canada is literally one of the best options for growing your Amazon business. So let's first start by just looking at US and Canada as countries and as Amazon markets. From a population standpoint, US has roughly 331 million people versus 38 million for Canada. So Canada is roughly about 10% of the size from a population standpoint. And what's unique about Canada, which is different than the US, is roughly 80% of that population is within a couple hours of the US border. So most of them are really in the southern part of Canada as a whole, and most of that population is on the East Coast in provinces like Ontario. From a Prime membership standpoint, there is a significant penetration of Amazon Prime members in the US. There's an estimate of roughly 165 million Prime users. So just about half of the US population has an Amazon Prime membership, which is pretty crazy. Much smaller in Canada. So it's estimated that's going to be about 3.5 million in 2022, which is about 10% of the Canadian population having Amazon Prime memberships. From a tax standpoint, there's basically state tax considerations when you're selling in the US, especially if you live in the US as an Amazon seller. And that's the Nexus program. Don't need to get into any of that. Versus Canada is generally going to have a general sales tax. So think of it like a federal sales tax on goods sold. And then there's very specific provinces that may have their own provincial sales tax. So if you live in Canada and your entity is Canadian, there's some additional provincial stuff if you're selling to people that live in your province. And then just simple stuff. The US is the last country holding out on the imperial system. So when you're doing packages, things like that, it's going to be inches, it's going to be pounds. Versus Canada is like basically everywhere else in the world, including other Amazon markets, where they're going to use the metric system. So centimeters, millimeters for your sizing, as well as kilograms for your weights. Now, despite the population size, despite the Prime membership size, what you can generally expect when you're selling in Canada and taking existing successful products from marketplaces like the US is about 5 to 20% of your US sales is what you can expect for Canada. Obviously, this is highly dependent on the product type, how many reviews you've got, the size of the market in Canada, lots of nuances, but that's a general range you can expect. What we've personally seen with products that we've taken from our successful US catalog and implemented into Canada FBA is about 8 to 15% of the US sales. So if you're selling 100 grand a month, you're doing awesome. Congratulations on having a 7-figure business. You can expect if you deployed that catalog in Canada to do about $8,000 to $15,000 a month. Benefits of selling in Canada, just building on the last video, is it's pretty much the easiest international market to enter, especially if you're selling in the US. There's same customer, same language, very minimal operational considerations, similar customers. You don't really have to change your listings around all that much, if at all. You can leverage your pool of US inventory if you house inventory in the US, or you can ship it direct from your manufacturer to Canada. Launches are easier. The reviews consolidate from other marketplaces, which can be massive for conversion rate and ease of launch. It's going to be less costly than launching new products. You get economies of scale because you can place bigger orders with your factory, as an example. If you're doing new creative works both in the US and Canada, so you get those economies of scale. You typically have higher product margins because you can price the product higher, and you've got more margins because things like pay-per-click tend to be a lot less expensive in Canada. But there are some downsides, so let's just kind of be aware of those as we look at this strategy. First of all, it is slightly smaller. It's 38 million people roughly. So there's markets like the UK and Germany that have typically a larger market size, a larger revenue potential than does Canada. Despite the fact that it's the easiest global market in my view to enter, there is still some operational burden. So you do need to set up some stuff with Canada. You do have an additional country to import stuff with. It's an additional set of inventory to manage, additional set of listings and pay-per-click to manage. You do have to plan your taxes. We're going to get into that in detail with your Canadian setup on how that works, but you do have to address Canadian taxes, the GST that's owed on goods sold there. It's awesome that reviews consolidate, but also negative reviews consolidate. So if you get a 1-star review in Canada, that may show up as people scan and look at the reviews for your product in other markets like the US. And then finally, there's the currency exchange. So you're going to get paid in Canadian dollars, but if you want to get that money into the country or bank with which you want to have the funds of your business, there's going to be exchanges and things like that that you need to be aware of. We're again going to cover how to set that up, how to do it best. But if you're transferring money across countries, you will have to address currency exchanges. But a final point here, as we're evaluating how to enter Canada and do it best, is you're probably already selling in Canada and you don't even know it. We're going to talk about this with the NARF remote fulfillment program, which now turns on automatically in most cases. So you might already be actually selling products in Canada, you don't know it. But also there's a crap load of hijackers that will basically drop ship from your product in the US into Canada. So they'll set up a listing or follow on your listing in Canada. They'll buy from your listing in the US and mark it up like 30, 40%. So you're probably already selling in Canada, you just don't know it. We're gonna go over the ways so you can capture that value, manage, grow it, and do it in the right way. So the purpose of this video is really just to understand why global as a growth strategy. There's a lot of different choices you can make as a brand builder in the Amazon space on how you can grow your business, and why in particular I really like and hone in on expanding globally as one of the lowest risk ways to do that. So let's start by looking at the growth levers. Like, what are the tools at our disposal to grow an Amazon business? You can launch brand new products on an existing brand. You can take existing products and launch variants, whether it's colors, sizes, bundles, differentiating features. You can enter new geographic markets with the same products and the same brand. You can go after new channels entirely, whether it's retail, Shopify, other marketplaces, etc. Or you can identify new customer segments with an existing brand to target and or new brands entirely. So how I prioritize and think about these both in terms of investment required, risk, ease of operations is as follows. First of all, expanding globally with certain markets. I wouldn't say this with all of them, but Canada is definitely one of them, where it's just an easy entry point, low cost, easy operationally, and the risk is a lot lower. Very close, if not the same, is launching new variations. So you've got a winning product and you just want to add a new color, etc. That's an easy way to grow and scale. But from there, it gets a little bit more opaque, a little bit more risky, and a little bit more hairy, frankly. You can launch new products. The challenge with new products is the payback on those, might be 4 to 6 months if you win. But even if you're really good, you might only have like a 70% success rate with new products. So there's definitely a lot of inherent risk with adding new products. You can look at new channels. You can say, hey, look, I've won this Amazon game or figured that out. I'm going to go ahead and run TikTok ads to a Shopify site, or I'm going to go into retailers, or I'm going to test a new marketplace like Walmart. All these, again, viable opportunities for growth. But in addition to the risk and time associated with these, the probability goes down. And frankly, from a focus standpoint, it tends to just be a lot harder to learn those skills to be successful. And then finally, you can launch a brand new brand. You can say, hey, I've got this one pretty locked and dialed. I've kind of hit this. I'm going to enter a brand new niche, or I'm going to target a new customer segment. Again, viable for growth. I've added brands myself many times, but you're starting from scratch. There's a lot of time. You got to rebuild. You got to reinvest. And oftentimes that cash, if put into an existing asset, tends to go further. So believing that entering global markets is one of the fastest and easiest ways to grow in my view, you can then decide, okay, well, which international market do I want to enter? My order on these is first Canada, and we're going to get into that in the next video on the details of why. UK would be the next. Germany is typically the third just because of the size, and it's a cornerstone of the EU market. Then there's some other niche European markets like Spain, Italy, etc. And then there's some trickier operational and kind of cultural markets, which is Japan and Australia. Not going to get into those here, but that's typically further down the ladder in terms of global expansion. But in my view, Canada is the easiest operationally, the simplest from a tax standpoint, and the place where the customer and offer congruence is a lot similar to core markets like the US if you're already selling there. So let's talk about the US. I love the US. It's where I've sold probably 95% of my products on Amazon. It's the biggest. It helped me find success with my brands. It's the largest market. It's the largest opportunity, but it's also got some drawbacks, and these drawbacks have definitely increased over the years. First of all, it's the highest competition because it's the place to be. You have a lot of sellers there, especially foreign sellers, which can tend to be cutthroat. Typically, because of that competition, there's a lot more price wars that take place, so your margins are slimmer. And especially over the last couple of years, we've seen increasing pay-per-click costs, increasing placements. So it's become much more of a pay-to-play market, which in addition to the price sensitivity has also reduced margins. And then the reality of new launches is that even if you're good, you probably only have about 70% of the products that you launch that you're going to continue long-term. Just the nature of the game. They're typically less predictable, even if you've got experience. And most importantly, the cash investment into getting cash out tends to be at least 90 days. And oftentimes this can stretch to 4 to 6 months before you actually get a payback, even on successful launches. Similarly, for those new channels, those are highly, highly unpredictable. Likely the lowest probability of success of all the different growth avenues. There's a pretty big learning curve and operational burden. And again, the cash investment in versus out creates some cash flow constraints. The reality of new brands is very similar. There's a lot of upfront costs that go in and sunk costs. There's an operational burden. You basically have to do everything twice if you've got multiple brands typically. And then because you're basically diluting your cash and your investment, even if it's your personal investment, there's typically reduced exit value or potential versus really going after all the growth avenues with a single brand. So for me, Canada is really the growth sweet spot for Amazon sellers. You rarely lose money because you're using existing products that have been successful in other markets like the US. You're typically going to add at least 5% top line growth to each product you deploy in Canada, and oftentimes that's 10 to 15%. It's probably the easiest operationally. There's not a whole lot new to it because you're using existing products. There's less competition in Canada, especially less cutthroat foreign competitors. You tend to see higher margins, easier launches, and you get economies of scale because you're using the same products. You can order bigger volumes from your factory, you can consolidate reviews, etc. So in the next video, we're going to dive in a little bit more on the specific nuances of the Canadian global market. All right, so we're going to start diving into the fun stuff. This is the numbers module, really all the nuances for you to consider as you enter the Canadian market. And we're going to start off by understanding how to evaluate demand in Amazon Canada. So we talked about this in the Why Canada video, but generally you can expect about 5 to 20% of your US sales and demand for successful products when you take those to Canada. But before you enter Canada with a market, there's some things that you need to really determine and find out. One, can you compete? So are the offers that exist in the .ca marketplace, are they offers that you can actually stand out against? How are they different from US versus Canada? You need to determine if you've got the budget. So typically the demand is lower in Canada. So if you've been successful in the US, you can likely find success and have the budget in Canada, but it's something you definitely want to understand. What is my cash investment and inventory investment going to be when I enter the Canadian market with a particular product? And then you also need to figure out, hey, well, how much inventory do I need to allocate for Canada if I'm going to enter it? So the best way to initiate this understanding of, hey, what's the market potential for in Canada for a particular product is literally, if you've sold the product already, find that core search term in the US as an example. That tends to be the big one. Type that into amazon.ca and just evaluate the demand using Helium 10 or other software tools. So we're now going to dive into an SOP on how to do this. It's going to be linked in the description down below. So feel free to snag that SOP if you want to implement this step by step. So the first thing you're going to want to do is just go to amazon.ca. Really critical that you put in the .ca. So you're looking specifically at the Canadian marketplace. Then just go to your search field and type in the core search term. We're going to look at an example of a golf rangefinder. So we just go to amazon.ca, type in golf rangefinder, hit go. Now we use Helium 10, but there's a lot of other Amazon softwares that do this. But basically you're going to want to click on that Chrome extension, go to X-ray in the case of Helium 10, just so we can see how those products on the top page of search results are doing. So we can see on this particular example, we've got search volume of 2136 on a monthly basis for a golf rangefinder. The total revenue of the front page is 650 grand Canadian. The average revenue of a listing on this front page is 15,000 a month. We've got an average price of 136. So this gives us a really good barometer, at least in terms of a market size revenue potential standpoint, what this product category pulls. And if say we think that we're going to slot into the top 5 as an example, we can get an idea on what that revenue range looks like, where we may need to price the product, what are the reviews of the competition, how many units do they turn over, etc. You can also click on search volume and look at a full year view. I definitely recommend this so you can see if there's any seasonal changes in Canada that may be different. Again, that can help you plan. If say you're looking at this now and it's low season and you think it's going to be 1,000 units a month, you can see it spike up in the summer and you may need to order 5 times as much. So make sure that you're also looking at the trend line for a full year in the Canadian search volume. And then one of the easiest ways to really test demand without doing a whole lot of investment is basically to activate the NARF, or North American Remote Fulfillment Program. We do this by setting up a Canadian listing first, which we're going to get into all the details of that in Module 3, Canada Setup. We then activate NARF or see if it's activated already. Again, we're going to get into videos on this. And then we basically turn that sucker on and start to see what kind of sales we get from that remote fulfillment program, where people are basically buying the product from a Canadian listing and Amazon is shipping it from our US batch of inventory. So again, we're going to dive into that into the Canada setup set of videos. But first part is to evaluate demand and see what it may be in amazon.ca. So in this second video of the numbers, we're going to get into the actual math of selling in Canada. This is pretty similar to the US, but there's definitely some nuances that I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of as they're evaluating profitability, as they're evaluating the financial mechanics of actually selling in Canada. So first, there's a lot of usual suspects that are going to be the same as selling in US or a lot of other markets on the Amazon platform. First, factory COGS, right? So whatever you're paying your factory, that's pretty much going to be the same. Freight, again, something else that you can calculate. There is some nuance if you're going to ship it to the US first and then into Canada, but this is all stuff that's going to be the same line item as it would be for, say, the US marketplace. You have duties to account for. The good news is that the duties in Canada are usually 0 or close to 0%, and certainly under 3% in most cases, so you don't have those punitive Trump tariffs. But you do have to evaluate the duties, and we're going to get into that in future modules. And then the Amazon fees. Obviously, the dollar amounts may change, but the referral fees that you get as a percentage of sales are the same thing in Canada. And then the fulfillment fees to ship each unit are also going to be structured very similar to Canada. Now, what's not the same is because you're dealing in a foreign currency, you obviously have a different exchange rate. So for things like factory COGS, if you want to understand what the margins are in Canada and you've got that factory COGS in the US, you're actually going to have to apply the Canadian cost to that factory cost to really understand profit. It depends on the market at any one time, but usually the Canadian exchange rate is somewhere around 1.3 to 1.36, depending on the time. So let's say that you've got a product that costs $100 in US dollars from your factory. That's going to be $136 if it's a 1.36 exchange rate in Canada. So you got to factor in the currency conversion both for your costs as well as the revenue and the price that you're going to set in Canada. And then when you turn that money, say from Canadian dollars into US dollars or to US account, the currency is going to impact what that amount is. So $1 in revenue in Canada is not going to be the same as $1 revenue in the US. Pretty obvious, but wanted to call that one out. The second is that you've got HST and GST to account for. This is the Canadian sales tax that's applied to sales there. Every single sale in Canada is going to have this, whereas in the US, depending on how you manage your state taxes, you may not have any taxes at all to account for. There's incremental freight. So even if you're shipping direct from your manufacturer in, say, China to Canada, there's only one port in Canada. It's on the West Coast in Vancouver. So you might have a lot of your product go to the East Coast where a lot of the population is in Canada. So you've got to truck multiple thousand kilometers from the Vancouver port into, say, Ontario. So even if you're shipping direct into Canada, there may be higher costs. Also, if you ship goods into the US and then use that US inventory to ship into Canada, we're going to get into all of this in the operations logistics videos, but there's obviously some additional transportation costs that you've got to account for there. If you're operating and housing inventory in Canada via 3PL, I've tended to see extremely high costs from those 3PLs in Canada. So the storage costs, the pick, pack, ship fees, the palletization fees, the labeling fees, the drayage fees, everything that kind of goes into storing and logistics in Canada tends to be more expensive than 3PLs in the US. And on the bright side, the ad cost dynamic tend to be a lot different. So when we're calculating ROI and evaluating a product in the US, we may be assuming somewhere between 10 and 15% on the total ad spend once that product kind of gets humming. In Canada, you can typically expect single digits. So we tend to see about an 8% ad cost in Canada. So when you're analyzing your numbers, you can typically hedge to expect to spend less money on a percentage basis on pay-per-click. All right, so the conversion rate calculation can give you a pretty good proxy in addition to just evaluating what it's looking like on the homepage for the core search term in terms of how you should price your product. But we've gone ahead and built a Canada-specific ROI calculator to really take it to the next level. So you can really hone in on those margin and or ROI goals that go into pricing your product. Also takes into account things like exchange rate, looking at COGS and shipping in US dollars and converting it to Canadian because most of us are going to be working in US dollars for those costs. And you can also layer in things like your estimated ad spend on a percentage basis as well as your estimated return rate. So basically with this ROI calculator, what you're really going to need to do is put in your inputs here, and then the calculations on the left-hand side there will do the rest. You can also throw in your product name here if you want to have one of these sheets for each one of your products in Canada. You can also copy these tabs and just have a core Google Sheets document, and then all your tabs have your different products because you may want to adjust these with real information or information as it changes if, say, your return rate's different or your COGS are different, etc. So all you really need to do here is put in the exchange rate. So you're going to look at this exchange rate probably every 2-3 months, make sure it hasn't changed a whole lot. It's actually gone in the favor of the US dollar, which is going to be a good thing for most Amazon sellers. But as of right now, January 8th, it's basically 1.36. Then you can put in your target price based on that analysis you did on the homepage. Like, where do you think you're going to slot in? And then you could also have like a launch or worst case price. So you're probably going to come aggressive out the gate to try to get some additional sales velocity and kind of get that ranking going up in Canada. And you might just face some price pressures that you can't quite get to your target price. So I like to leave kind of 2 different price points, one where you want it to be and one kind of worst case / launch pricing. These next 3 items here are going to be put in US dollars. So you're going to put the COGS of your product. This is just the factory price. You should have this already if you're selling in the US. The duties, again, you can ask a freight forwarder or you can use Clear It used in the resources here to get your actual duty rate, but you can estimate your dollar duty per product. And then you can also estimate your freight both into the US and then into Canada. So you can kind of play with this number a little bit. It's likely going to be more expensive than your current US product, but all 3 of those prices combined together will basically give your landed COGS. So those are in US dollars. That's why this is blue here. In that table on the left, it's going to calculate the Canadian dollar amount based on your exchange rate here. Then you can look at your Amazon referral fee here on a percentage basis, as well as the FBA fee that's associated with the product that's of your size. You can either look at a competitor's product that's similarly sized, or you can look at your Amazon Canada FBA listing, and it's going to actually give you those fees. So I've included a table down here below. If you basically just go into your Canada account, go to FBA inventory, this column here on the very far right says estimated fee per unit sold. So this product here, it says $11.99 with the $7.74 FBA fee. So that $7.74 is what you basically put in here. And then the other fee there is just a calculation based on your current price. Then got tacos here. You can expect to typically spend between 8 and 10% in Canada. You might be a little bit beefier than that when you first launch, but you're going to see ad costs that are going to be less than your US listing. So if you want to take your US tacos for that product, you can probably shave a solid 5% off depending on where you're at. And then I just put a standard of return rate on 5%. Should be similar to your US product here, so you can just plug that in as needed and then monitor it. So once you plug all those values in, it's basically going to kind of run everything over here. It's going to give you the target case, which is if you hit that, in this case, $59.99 price point. You can see all of the gross profit here, which is 39.49%. And then it plugs in the ad cost, the return rate gives you a net profit percentage, and then an ROI, including ad spend as well as return rates, which I think is a truer ROI. So we typically want to be above 100%. That's not possible in all cases, but that's generally speaking going to be a pretty healthy long-term product if you can get that ROI north of 100. So you're going to see this kind of green. If it's north of 100, it's going to be yellow. If it's 75 to 99, and if it's less than 75, that'll be red. So it can kind of be a bit of an indicator on where the ROI is at. And then it does the exact same calculations for worst case. If you don't have this table here because you haven't uploaded a product yet, you can find your estimated FBA fee as well as referral fee by clicking on that link. It's basically the Canadian COGS. So use this. Again, ideally north of 100% on your pricing. You can play with these target prices and launch worst case prices over here to kind of see different percentages. And then anytime any of your COGS, duties, freight, return rates, ad spend change, you can update this table and you have kind of an ongoing ROI-based pricing document that you can leverage for your catalog. All right, so because we're selling in a new marketplace with different currency, with different profit dynamics, with different competition, etc., I want to talk really about the pricing strategy and how to hone in on a pricing strategy when you enter the Canadian market with a product that's, say, selling in the US. Because I can almost guarantee it's not going to be the same price. And there's really 3 factors I think you need to think about when pricing a product in Canada. One is just the market conditions, right? So how many sellers are there? How are they priced? How good are those competitors? What are their reviews? Are they brand names? Where is my offer value stack going to stand when I'm on, say, the first page of search results for a keyword that I care about? Very similar to the US, but you're going to want to look at that distinctly for the Canadian market. And oftentimes you'll tend to find some additional advantages from a pricing standpoint than you would in the US because it's a little bit less competitive, because people don't pay as much attention from a competitive standpoint in Canada. But you're going to need to look at all those nuances of the .ca marketplace and see where you slot in. The second is looking at ROI based on kind of a price point that you think you're going to be able to sell at. What's the ROI of that? Again, you've got less ad costs, but you've also got potentially more logistics costs. You've got exchange rates. You've got to vary all those things in and understand, hey, what do I want my ROI to be for the SKU in Canada? And then finally, you've got to understand the exchange rate. Again, $1 in Canada is not the same as $1 in the US. So you're typically going to be priced higher in Canada for just the exchange rate alone. And then it may be less competitive, so you can increase the price again. Maybe you've got a better ROI because you're going to be spending way less on ads, you can increase it again. So all these variables you need to really factor into how am I going to price my product in Canada to be effective and to meet the profitability thresholds that you have. So let's look at this USA to Canada example for the category of golf rangefinders. So in the US, we can see it's about 10,000 searches a month. Revenue is 12 million. The average revenue is $840K per month. And then the average price is $131. And you've got a mixture of big brands like Callaway versus just Amazon native brands that are just kind of winning on the Amazon game. In Canada, you've got less search volume. The average price here is $149, so it's higher than the US. And then if we just look here, there tends to be less branded players in Canada. So maybe those big brands don't sell in the Canadian marketplace, or maybe they don't have retail distributors that sell there. So you got to look at all those dynamics and just kind of compare and contrast where you think the pricing is. Peeling the onion back a little bit more, you can kind of just see the category average in the US is 131, which if you applied the exchange rate of 1.36 would be about 178 in Canada. You've got organic leaders. You've got premium branded players, and then you've got contenders like new up and coming brands. So this is a comparison that I just like to do just to evaluate US if I'm selling there already versus Canada. Again, typically you're going to tend to see this be a situation where you can price up your product, but there's also circumstances where you might need to price it down, or it may be too aggressive for you to enter the Canadian market based on those competitive dynamics. So there's really three, or a combination of three different strategies for how you can price your products. If you're just starting out and say doing the NARF program, you may literally just want to apply a Canadian exchange rate and topside your price and maybe round it to the highest dollar. So take your price in the US, multiply it by 1.6, and then round it up or down to a normal price. I definitely would recommend rounding it up or down. You'll see a lot of people in, say, the NARF program that have weird pricing like 37.26. Just a little bit weird from a customer standpoint. I'd probably just price that at $36.99 as an example if I were transferring that price. So one quick way to do it, if you don't want to waste a lot of time and just want to test demand quick, is just do an exchange rate. The other is to really look at the detailed ROI that we went over and understand what your incremental operating costs may be, understanding exchange rates to both your COGS and the price, understanding the Amazon Canada fees, and looking at things like return rates, which tend to be lower in Canada, as well as your TACOS or ad spend, which tend to be lower. Run the math, and you may have your own threshold target that you've got for ROI, price based on that ROI, again, typically to the wholest dollar. And then the final way to price is just looking at market positioning. Like regardless of the numbers, hey, I think I've got to be priced here to be competitive against big brands, contenders, top organic results, etc. Price it at that amount for a while and see how successful you're going to be. And again, you can fuse these strategies together a little bit, but those are three different ways to be thinking about strategically approaching price in Canada. But again, typically you're going to find that you can price higher in Canada than you would in the US and generate more unit margin because there tends to be less competition, less aggressive pricing from competitors, less ad expense, and a higher ROI. Now, one thing to consider when you first start out selling in Canada using the NARF program, again, we're going to get into that in Module 3. It's usually the best way to start, is that basically what happens is your listing is going to be there in Canada. It's going to be a Canadian listing. But if somebody in Canada buys it, it's going to ship from the US into Canada. So typically those listings for the NARF program are not only going to include the price that you want to sell, but that customer is going to have to pay for the shipping and duties from the US to Canada. So you may have, say, a $40 product and you figured out, hey, $39.99 is my price I want to sell in Canada, makes sense. A customer may see that $39.99 plus $15 shipping. So you're tend to going to find lower conversion rates via the NARF program because customers also have to pay for shipping and duties of their individual product that they purchase. So for the final video of the numbers module section, we're going to dive into the ops and duty costs that are specific to selling in Canada. Now, your operational costs are going to be predicated on how you actually ship your inventory into the Canadian marketplace once you turn on FBA. I'm going to get into this in the ops logistics section, show you exactly how we do it, ways that you may want to do it. But some considerations here. First is, are you shipping directly from your manufacturer, doing ocean containers into Vancouver and then into Canada FBA? Or are you going to take existing inventory that exists in US warehouses and ship that up through the border into Canadian marketplaces? Each of those has different costs, both good and bad, that you need to consider. The second is whether or not you're going to ship full containers, or you're going to ship full truckloads, or whether you're going to ship UPS individual master cartons, either from your manufacturer or from the US. Again, each of those has different considerations. And then finally, US versus Canadian 3PLs. I mentioned it in an earlier video, but Canadian 3PLs tend to be significantly more expensive for all costs, especially storage. So those storage costs, those warehousing, those fun operational plumbing costs that we all see are going to be different depending on if you house the inventory in the US or in Canada. Again, we'll dive into these in a lot more detail in the ops logistics. We'll talk about some of the partners we use, etc., but there are some costs to consider. The second thing is duties. So in the US marketplace, as an example, you've got an HTS code, which is a harmonized tariff code, which basically determines what the category of your product. Each category has its own duty to import from, say, the country of origin of China. These tend to be significantly higher for the US because during the Trump presidential era, there were Trump tariffs that could be as high as 25% plus for products. In Canada, they tend to be 0 to 3%. So the good news is that your tariffs and your customs into Canada tend to be lower. The best way to find out what your actual Canadian code is, which is an HS code, very similar to Europe, and not an HTS code, is to speak to a broker and just say, hey, here's the product I sell. I currently sell it in the US. This is the HTS code. Can you really advise me on what the HS Canada code is? We recommend going to this site, clearit.ca, which I'm going to include a link in the description down below. You can basically search that list and see what it may be. We've also got some connections for you, Clearit being the main partner here, where you can ask them, or you can ask your freight forwarder, hey, what's the HS code I should use when I'm importing this product category into Canada? So we'll leave a link down below and reference in the Rolex to Clearit. That's one resource that you can use to see. But you're going to want to kind of see, hey, what's the tariff amount that I'm going to have to pay to import goods into Canada? All right, so because we're selling in a new marketplace with different currency, with different profit dynamics, with different competition, etc., I want to talk really about the pricing strategy and how to hone in on a pricing strategy when you enter the Canadian market with a product that's, say, selling in the US. Because I can almost guarantee it's not going to be the same price. And there's really three factors I think you need to think about when pricing a product in Canada. One is just the market conditions, right? So how many sellers are there? How are they priced? How good are those competitors? What are their reviews? Are they brand names? Where is my offer value stack going to stand when I'm on, say, the first page of search results for a keyword that I care about? Very similar to the US, but you're going to want to look at that distinctly for the Canadian market. And oftentimes you'll tend to find some additional advantages from a pricing standpoint than you would in the US because it's a little bit less competitive, because people don't pay as much attention from a competitive standpoint in Canada. But you're going to need to look at all those nuances of the .ca marketplace and see where you slot in. The second is looking at ROI based on kind of a price point that you think you're going to be able to sell at. What's the ROI of that? Again, you've got less ad costs, but you've also got potentially more logistics costs. You've got exchange rates. You've got to vary all those things in and understand, hey, what do I want my ROI to be for the SKU in Canada? And then finally, you've got to understand the exchange rate. Again, $1 in Canada is not the same as $1 in the US. So you're typically going to be priced higher in Canada for just the exchange rate alone. And then it may be less competitive, so you can increase the price again. Maybe you've got a better ROI because you're going to be spending way less on ads. You can increase it again. So all these variables you need to really factor into how am I going to price my product in Canada to be effective and to meet the profitability thresholds that you have. So let's look at this USA to Canada example for the category of golf rangefinders. So in the US, we can see it's about 10,000 searches a month. Revenue is 12 million. The average revenue is $840K per month. And then the average price is $131. And you've got a mixture of big brands like Callaway versus just Amazon native brands that are just kind of winning on the Amazon game. In Canada, you've got less search volume. The average price here is $149, so it's higher than the US. And then if we just look here, there tends to be less branded players in Canada. So maybe those big brands don't sell in the Canadian marketplace, or maybe they don't have retail distributors that sell there. So you got to look at all those dynamics and just kind of compare and contrast where you think the pricing is. Peeling the onion back a little bit more, you can kind of just see the category average in the US is 131, which if you applied the exchange rate of 1.36 would be about 178 in Canada. You've got organic leaders, you've got premium branded players, and then you've got contenders like new up and coming brands. So this is a comparison that I just like to do just to evaluate US if I'm selling there already versus Canada. Again, typically you're going to tend to see this be a situation where you can price up your product, but there's also circumstances where you might need to price it down, or it may be too aggressive for you to enter the Canadian market based on those competitive dynamics. So there's really three, or a combination of three different strategies for how you can price your products. If you're just starting out and say doing the NARF program, you may literally just want to apply a Canadian exchange rate and topside your price and maybe round it to the highest dollar. So take your price in the US, multiply it by 1.6, and then round it up or down to a normal price. I definitely would recommend rounding it up or down. You'll see a lot of people in, say, the NARF program that have weird pricing like 37.26. Just a little bit weird from a customer standpoint. I'd probably just price that at $36.99 as an example if I were transferring that price. So one quick way to do it, if you don't want to waste a lot of time and just want to test demand quick, is just do an exchange rate. The other is to really look at the detailed ROI that we went over and understand what your incremental operating costs may be, understanding exchange rates to both your COGS and the price, understanding the Amazon Canada fees, and looking at things like return rates, which tend to be lower in Canada, as well as your TACOS or ad spend, which tend to be lower. Run the math, and you may have your own threshold target that you've got for ROI, price based on that ROI, again, typically to the wholest dollar. And then the final way to price is just looking at market positioning. Like regardless of the numbers, hey, I think I've got to be priced here to be competitive against big brands, contenders, top organic results, etc. Price it at that amount for a while and see how successful you're going to be. And again, you can fuse these strategies together a little bit, but those are three different ways to be thinking about strategically approaching price in Canada. But again, typically you're going to find that you can price higher in Canada than you would in the US and generate more unit margin because there tends to be less competition, less aggressive pricing from competitors, less ad expense, and a higher ROI. Now, one thing to consider when you first start out selling in Canada using the NARF program, again, we're going to get into that in Module 3. It's usually the best way to start, is that basically what happens is your listing is going to be there in Canada. It's going to be a Canadian listing. But if somebody in Canada buys it, it's going to ship from the US into Canada. So typically those listings for the NARF program are not only going to include the price that you want to sell, but that customer is going to have to pay for the shipping and duties from the US to Canada. So you may have, say, a $40 product and you figured out, hey, $39.99 is my price I want to sell in Canada, makes sense. A customer may see that $39.99 plus $15 shipping. So you're tend to going to find lower conversion rates via the NARF program because customers also have to pay for shipping and duties of their individual product that they purchase. So after you set up your Canadian listing for a specific product or your entire catalog, the next step in the expanding to Canada process is to activate or ensure that the NARF program is ready to go for the products that you want to sell. Now, the reason we do this before doing a Canada FBA setup where we actually ship physical inventory in is because you actually need to get some Canadian numbers from the Canadian government to manage your taxes prior to doing FBA. And that process takes about 1 to 2 months, depending on how fast your form gets approved. We're going to get into the specifics of how to do that in future videos in this module. But long story short, you're going to want to activate NARF right now so you can get going in the Canadian market and start to see some sales come through. Now, NARF stands for North American Remote Fulfillment. The concept is basically that you have all of your inventory in the US marketplace if that's where you're selling. And if a customer in either Mexico or Canada wants to purchase your product, they can. And Amazon will basically ship that customer inventory from the US to either Mexico or Canada. The main difference is this isn't going to be a prime offer and the customer is going to pay the shipping and duties for that country and for that product to receive it. And it might also take a little bit more transport time. So the conversion rates tend to be lower, but it's an easy way where you literally have to do nothing but activate it and create a Canada specific offer to get this thing rolling. One important note though is that not all products qualify for the NARF program. So things like wood products, products that have batteries in them, some electronics, some toys, some supplements, There's certain categories of products where Amazon, due to compliance and regulatory reasons, will not ship the product from Canada to the US. We're going to show you how to pull the report and see if any of them don't qualify, but just know that not every product in your catalog may be eligible for the NARF program, in which case you've got to actually set up an FBA listing, set up your Canadian entity, and actually get that product shipped directly into Canada before you can sell it. Now, the pros and cons of NARF. Starting with the pros, it's basically instant setup. In fact, recently, most products are going to be automatically enrolled in the NARF program, so you might actually be selling via NARF and not know it. But if not, you can easily activate it using a simple flat file that takes about 10 to 15 minutes, which we're going to get into that process here. It's very good to test demand. So before you invest in shipping inventory into Canada, maybe setting up warehousing, figuring out logistics partners, you can really test the market with a NARF offer. And if you're getting sales on an NARF offer, it's usually a pretty good indication that it makes sense to go the full step of doing Canada FBA. This helps mitigate hijackers. I talked about this in a previous video, but you're probably selling in Canada even if you don't think you are. Oftentimes there's many offers on every listing where they're basically purchasing your product from the US, they're marking it up and selling it to customers in Canada. So you may actually be selling product via hijackers and you don't know it. But setting up the Canadian list price like we had in the previous video on setting up your listing and activating NARF means that your price is typically going to be much lower than hijackers. And in that case, you can tend to capture sales that hijackers are currently capturing in Canada. And then the final pro is that you can do custom pricing. The way that we set up that listing, we now have a Canada offer. We can actually customize the price. So it's the most competitive price. It's the best from a margin standpoint. And you don't get weird pricing like $37.48. You can make it like $37.99, more customer psychology based pricing. There's obviously some cons. From a customer standpoint, it is going to typically be a lower conversion rate because they're going to have to pay additional shipping duties and have additional time to receive that product in Canada. This really hurts a lot in Q4 when, say, somebody's ordering something for Christmas and the ship time might be 2 weeks, versus if it were FBA, it might be a handful of days. So it's going to impact your conversion rate. There's definitely more cost that a customer is going to experience when ordering a product via NARF. While you can run pay-per-click, because the conversion rates are lower, you're typically not going to drive as much demand or spend as much money to grow a NARF listing as you would a Canada FBA listing. There are some disadvantages with taxes. We're going to get into this in its entirety in the tax section, but long story short, you do have to pay GST, or customers pay GST in Canada. There's ways to recoup some of those costs once you actually formally set up a GST HST number. Again, don't burn brain cells thinking about it now, but there's basically advantages to doing FBA from a tax standpoint. There's typically going to be a growth cap because it's not a prime offer, because it's more expensive for the customer, because it takes longer to ship. You're typically not going to capture as many sales in the NARF program as you would shipping physical inventory into Canada FBA. And then finally, we talked about this, but the NARF program is not going to work for all ASINs. So even if you want to do NARF for certain products, Amazon may prevent you for that particular product category. So at a minimum for starting out, I recommend today that you set up your Canada listings first and then activate all of the offers for NARF that are eligible. Because it takes 1 to 2 months to set up your formal Canadian entity, you can use this time to start generating sales and really evaluating the demand for those SKUs via the NARF, even if those sales are going to be less than they would be via Canada FBA. All right, so let's go into this SOP. Again, I'm going to link that SOP down below so you can follow this step by step in a PDF document at your will. But you're first going to want to log into this site called sellercentral.amazon.com/RAFN/inventory. Once you type that into Google and make sure you're logged into your Seller Central account, it's going to basically pop up this page view here. You're going to want to click on that Generate Report button right there. And then basically it's going to take, 2 to 5 minutes for it to run. So just hit refresh after a couple minutes if you haven't seen it show up already. But once that's done generating, you can just click that download report and it's going to download an XLS file or an Excel file for you. If you've got Excel and that's how you operate, just open it in Excel and make edits. We tend to use Google Sheets. So we would just go to a Google Sheets. We would import that spreadsheet in its entirety. Now, once you do have that spreadsheet open, there's going to be 3 different tabs. You really don't need to pay attention much to these first 2 tabs, but that enrollment tab is going to show you the NARF program settings for all of your existing catalog in the US marketplace. And basically what you're going to want to see here is yes or no in column F, whether or not you want to enable or disable the Canada NARF program. So because we actually want to set up NARF, we want that to be yes for every single product that we want to turn on for NARF. Once you turn that to yes and you re-upload the file, it's going to again take 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes a day in some cases. It's then going to be activated as a NARF offer. And then those listings that we set up for Canada FBA are going to start showing up in the Amazon.ca catalog, and it's going to show using the price and all the other settings for that listing that we had established. If your product is not eligible, it's likely going to say no here, or you're going to have issues uploading it, in which case you can tick it with Amazon, or you can leave a comment below for your category. But again, some categories aren't going to work. Now, an important point, we're going to get into this later when we actually set up formal Canada FBA product, if that's how you want to do it, shipping product actually into Amazon. What we're going to need to do when we do that step is we're actually going to need to reopen this file, and we're going to turn it to no. So we want to turn off the NARF program for products that are actually going to be in Canada FBA with physical inventory. But if you have nothing set up yet, just select these all as yes. You're going to want to save that file. After it's saved, you go back to that sheet, and then it lets you upload that file. So you just choose the file, select the file that you actually want to do, and go to upload. And then again, within usually about 10 to 15 minutes, usually in under a day, you're going to see your product and your offers for NARF activated, and you're ready to start selling in Canada by doing nothing but just using your US-based inventory. All right, so the purpose of this video is all about how to actually edit your Canadian listing. So when we first created the listing, we really just changed the offer, which is the price, and designating it as FBA. What this next step is going to enable us to do is actually edit the content specific to Canada. So if we want to have a different title and play with the keywords there, if we want to change the bullets around, any of the back-end content of a listing, we're going to go through two methods on how to do that. So we're going to start by going through the Seller Central editor, which most of you should be familiar with if you've got products in the US or other marketplaces, and briefly talk about the flat files as well. Key point here, you're going to want to make sure that you're logged into your Canadian Seller Central account. So if you go to the drop-down menu, you're likely going to default to the US when you log into Seller Central. You're going to want to go to that drop-down, make sure that you actually select Canada so that you're editing your Canadian listings. You don't want to be playing with your US listings if you don't want to. So the first step on doing the edit just within Seller Central is to click on that top left menu, again from your Canadian Seller Central account, go to Inventory, Manage FBA Inventory, and then it's going to have a list of all the products that you have set up for FBA in Canada. Select the one that you actually want to edit, and then just click that edit button, and then it's going to pull up this menu, which you've probably seen before for other listings. So if you remember before, we basically set up that offer page. It's going to give you some more details there, and then most of the stuff that you're going to want to tweak is likely in that product details section, which is title, bullets, etc. So all you need to do is click on whatever you want to edit here, save and finish, and just like the US, you're going to make updates to your listing. Now, if you are brave enough to use flat files, they can be a great way to edit listings, and you can edit multiple listings at once. Basically, you go back to that main menu from your Canadian account, go to Reports, Inventory Reports. It's going to pull up a page like this. You just click on the Inventory Report drop down, and then go to the Category Listing Report. You're going to want to select the date there. Just go back as far as possible to at least as early as when you would have ever created a listing. So use like a date of like 2018 or something like that before you even started creating listings. Save that file. It's going to take a handful of minutes to generate. Once it's done in 2 to 5 minutes or so, you just go down, download it, work it into Google Sheets, and you can make any edits there that you wish to the various content or attributes of your listing. You can save that file again as an XLS and then re-upload that back into your catalog. So 2 quick and easy ways to edit your Canadian listings, pretty simple stuff. All right, so the purpose of this video is all about how to do Canada-specific images for your listings in Canada. By default, it's going to be using the US-based listing photos and content for your actual listing, which in some cases you may not want to do. So what we're going to do here is walk through the process on doing localized images, which means you can use Canada-specific listing photos if you wish. Now, in most cases, most people might be like, you know what, it's US, Canada, not a whole lot's different culturally. Obviously, you don't need to do translations in most cases. I can just use my US listings. But there may be some circumstances where you want to use Canada-specific imagery. Maybe there's seasonality that's specific to Canada that you want to have images of somebody in snow or something a little bit longer than you would in the US. You may have actual metric measurements, so you may want to use centimeters instead of inches, etc. But generally speaking, most Canadians can understand US stuff pretty simply. Another example, so I'm born and raised in Canada, even though I've been in the US, my company's US based. So what I do is put like Canadian founder just to kind of tie into the culture there. So there are some circumstances where you want to use Canada specific images, and we're going to break down how to do that right here. So the first thing you're going to want to do, again, make sure you're logged into your Seller Central Canada account when you do this. From the drop down, go to the top left menu. You're going to want to go to Catalog, Upload Images from the drop down. It's going to pull up this page. I realize it's a bit of an eye chart here, but basically this is the bulk image upload process. And you basically just want to follow through all of those individual steps. There's an actual link on the far right, which is going to basically show how you want to name stuff. So once you click on that, it's going to give you the country specific upload criteria. Then you can go to the name your image files thing. And then it basically pulls up all the variant codes. So basically what you need to do is you need to save your Canada specific images using these variant codes here that are specific to your Canadian listing. Once you name those files appropriately, you can then go back here and then just drag and drop those images in there as needed. But you need to use that naming nomenclature here on those variant codes to get it done. And then all you need to do is upload that, save it. Again, give it 10 to 15 minutes. It should be refreshed and ready to go. If you ever want to check to see if the Canadian images are being shown, you can come back to this page here and go to submission status. And then it's going to give you an idea on where that product is at. So that's the process. If you want to do Canada specific images or really any specific images for other countries, you can use just the different codes on that page to get it done. All right, so we've set up our listing. We've talked about how you can actually edit the various content. We've talked about how you can customize images for your listings in Canada. Now we can talk about A+ content as well as your stores. Now this is a bummer, but it's just the reality of the beast with Amazon. You do not have your USA A+ content for your listings, and you don't have your USA store transfer over. So you've got to recreate those for each of your listings. In the case of the store, you've got to recreate your store for Canada. It's the exact same process of setting up your A+ content. It's the exact same process as setting up your store, but you've got to do it specifically for your Canadian business. So how to do that? Let's start out with the A+ content first. You're going to go to that top left toggle. You're going to go to advertising, then you're going to go to A+ content manager. Same deal here. You're going to select the products with which you need to actually create your content for, and then you just need to upload your images. Takes a little bit of time for it to get approved, sometimes up to a week. But you can basically replicate the content if you wish for your USA listing, or you can do some custom A+ content for your Canadian listings. Then in terms of your Canada store, you basically just go to the top left button here, and then there's going to be a drop down here on stores, and then you just go to manage stores, and then you just go here to this stores toggle and you can create your store. This is going to be for brand register sellers only. So if you don't have a trademark or a trademark in process and you don't have brand registry, you can't do that. But if you do, that's the process to set both of those up. All right, so the purpose of this video is to go through the RC1 form, which is going to be required to get your business number as well as to get your GST HST number, which is going to be important when you ship goods into Canada via FBA and start selling and need to pay that GST tax. We're also going to get an import-export number here, although that is something you could also get through your freight forwarder. All of the contacts, if you need help filling out this form, are going to be down below. To fax in the form, down below. Import-export help, those contacts are going to be below. This is literally for educational purposes only. I definitely recommend that you enact a professional here. So we're going to go through this as an example. If you are not based in Canada and if you have a US LLC, that's kind of the scenario we're mapping out here. But there's nuances to all this stuff. I'm not an expert at these forms. You're going to want to read each of the questions in detail. And if any of these scenarios don't apply to you, you're probably going to want to enact one of the people that we have down below. But you're going to go to the Canada website. There's going to be a link that's going to be included in this SOP that you can get to. You can fill this out online, although we faxed it in. So the form we're going to be going through here is this PDF fillable, savable RC1-fill-19E form, and fill it out. But there is a way to do it online, just not something that I've done before. So fax tends to be the easiest way to do that. All right, so let's go through the step-by-step SOP here. So you're going to go to that URL there, which is going to let you download the form by clicking there. You're going to save that file, and then you're going to go ahead and open that PDF, and it's going to pull up a document like this, which you're going to fill out. So the first thing you're going to want to do is that select the I want to register for a business number, a BN number, part A. You're then going to click the import export, assuming you don't have one already. If you've imported goods before, your freight forwarder might have already gotten you one on your behalf. So that's a decision point whether you want that or not. But in this case, we're going to assume that we don't have one yet. And then we're also going to select the GST HST toggle there, the part B, which is the core number we're going to need for paying taxes. Now, again, this is under the assumption that you've got a US based LLC. If you're Canadian or have a different company structure, this isn't going to apply to you. But if you do have a US based LLC and you're not a Canadian resident, you're going to select the other. And then in that box right there, you're just going to type in limited liability corporation. And then are you incorporated? Again, if you have an LLC, that answer is yes. Then you want to select that you're going to add a copy of certificate of incorporation. So this is going to be wherever you filed your LLC originally. You're going to get a document from the IRS. That's where we're also going to include with this fax. So select that toggle. And then you just want to put your name and address. Really important here with name, address, phone number is this is where they're going to mail you paperwork. This is where they're going to call you, and they likely will be calling you. So just make sure that that's accurate and you're receiving mail and calls on those numbers and addresses. The social insurance number, unless you're Canadian, you leave that one blank. And then for part A3, you just want to put in your legal entity. So XYZ LLC plus all of the business address information. Now down below, it's going to say to describe your major business activity. This doesn't need to be specific product, but you do want to be talking about the product category or type here. So we just put in here to type sell XYZ product type online on Amazon.ca and e-commerce. Inventory will be imported into Canada and stored in Canadian warehouses and shipped to Canadian customers using the Amazon FBA program. That's some recommended language. Again, you may need to customize that based on your situation. Down below, it's going to say add 3 main product categories. Again, this isn't a specific product. This is just a product category. So it could be sporting goods as an example. It doesn't need to be all your individual products. And then you need to include the percentage of sales beside that product category. It asks for 3 of the main ones. Now this section here, you're going to need to read each of these individually. Again, if you're a Canadian, it's going to be a little bit different, but read them individually because your toggles may change. But generally speaking, these are the ones that most sellers are going to want to select. It's going to be yes, yes, no, 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 yes, no, yes, no. So there's a copy of this PDF saved down below that you can see, but those are the recommended toggles. But again, you're going to want to kind of check for your specific situation. So then for this next one, part B1, it's going to be the same as part A3, all that address name information we selected earlier, but you'll notice here that there's an email address field, which they didn't include that above. So this is one field that you're going to want to fill out with your email address. So I've just made that point there, but add your email address here. And then moving on to part B2, assuming you have no inventory in Canada yet and you haven't shipped FBA inventory in yet, it's basically asking what your inventories are. So we're going to say 0 there, but if you do have inventories, you need to account for that value there. And then under the enter the total revenue worldwide taxable supplies, just leave that blank. Sometimes they need it, but if you leave it blank in most cases, you should be fine. They will call you if they've got questions and you can speak with the person there if needed, if they're reviewing your form. So I just have leave blank there. And then you want to select no and just remain on the default December 31st schedule. If you want to change the taxable period to align with your corporate entity, you can do that. But generally speaking, the end of the year is the best there. So I just leave this date blank and then select no on that one. And then in terms of the enter the effective date of the registration, this is a little bit of nuance. I recommend just using today's date or the date that you're filling out this form. The reality is that you won't be enacted into GST, HST until you get your business number and then until you ship your goods in. So it could be 1 to 2 months before they review this form or a couple weeks. Some people bump it out a couple weeks to save some time just in case. Generally speaking though, I just throw in today's date. The one exception to that is if you're right at the end of the year. So if you're filling this out like December 20th and this form is probably not going to be looked at until the new year, you may want to bump that into the new year just so you don't have a filing in a year where you basically didn't sell any goods. But generally speaking, it's going to be today's date on that. And then on the part 3 reporting period, it's basically asking if you want to change the frequency to be more frequent on reporting for GST. I would say no on that one. And then the box down below that is basically going to be dependent on your Canada sales. So I think most folks are going to be 1.5 million or less, especially if they're first just setting this up, in which case you're going to default to annual filing. So you basically just need to, for the calendar year, file by I think it's March for your GST, HST. Again, I've got the tax professional down below that can help with that. But you want the longest amount possible. There's quarterly and monthly selections that you could make if you wanted to file quarterly and monthly. But if you're doing less than 1.5 million in sales, that's the one you're going to want to select and keep it to annual. Now, if you're doing between 1.5 and 6 million, you're going to have to file quarterly and select that toggle. If you're doing more than 6 million, you're going to have to do monthly and you're going to have to select that toggle. But for most people, it's going to be this 1.5 million or less. For the F1, it's going to be the same as A3, so you can select that box there. It's just all your address information, and then you can select English as the language. And then this is a question too, where the type of account. Do you want to be just an importer, just an exporter, or both an importer and an exporter? 98% of the cases plus, we're probably only going to be importing goods into Canada. It's going to be stay there and be sold there. However, there are going to be potential circumstances where you need to export inventory back, say, to the US. So maybe you sent a bunch of stuff to Canada and you've got more in there, you got out of stock in the US, you might actually want to bring that stuff back into the US, in which case you're going to actually be exporting goods. You might also have a situation where you ship too much inventory in and you need to scrap it, or you need to bring it back to the US for some reason, and you may need to bring it back over the border. So even though it's an outlier case that you need to export out of Canada, recommend selecting both importer and exporter on that section, part F2. And then it's going to ask what the type of goods you're going to be exporting. For here, we basically just recommend saying few goods will be exported. In cases where export is needed, the products will be XYZ category. So just keep it simple. And then in terms of the dollar value that you're going to be exporting, again, since we don't expect to do much, put minimal in there. Most of the time this is going to pass the test, but they will call you if they've got questions and need to refine that value. And then the effective date of the registration for import-export, I would basically just use the same date as the GST, HST, which again, we recommend being today's date. All right, so part H for the certification, you just need to put your first and last name in there. Then you select an owner. And then you're basically done. You basically just need to fill this out and you need to sign it at the bottom. You need to date when you sign it. Then you're going to print that sucker out. You're going to attach your certificate of incorporation, and then you can fax it per the instructions on the Canada RC1 website. Fax it into Canada. And I've got a digital fax provider resource down below if you want to use that. Again, not professional advice. This is how most people will fill it out, but every circumstance is different. If you need help filling it out or have questions filling it out, we've got resources down below that can help you out. All right, so the final video here that we're going to go into is basically everything to do with the filings necessary for Canadian sales tax. Now, I realize except for maybe a couple weirdos that bought this course that love accounting, most of us don't. But this is one of the necessary steps to do business in Canada properly via Canada FBA. Once you've actually sent physical inventory in and customers are paying that general sales tax, you've got that RC1 number that you filed for your HST, GST number. This video is going to be all about how to understand that, how we approach it, how you may want to approach it too. So I got to say this disclaimer, this is for educational purposes only. I am not an attorney. I'm not an accountant. I don't know the Canadian sales tax system. So I'm just going to walk through what we approach, but you definitely want to engage with some professionals in this area to do it correctly. Also, the way that we recommend things, specifically with how Amazon collects sales tax and how we pay at the end of the year, may not be exactly how you want to do it in your business. So you got to make that call. We recommend KB Financial. I'm going to include in the last slide here as well as in the link below to that partner. But this is who we use to file our annual Canadian GST filings. You may want to as well. Again, we've done some of the hard yards there to find a partner that we think works. So feel free to leverage them if you want to get into the nuances and do this correctly. So one important rule, and this is different than a lot of the EU VAT marketplaces if you've ever navigated European taxes before, and that's if you have over 30,000 Canadian sales anywhere in the world, you're required to file these taxes. So using current exchange rates, that basically means if you sold over $22,000 in a year across the entire planet, you are required to file this number. If you're just starting out and you have $0, you may not need to file yet, but as soon as you cross that threshold, you are going to be required to file these GST taxes. Now, just a refresher, if you either don't know or haven't sold in Amazon US before, this is basically how the US sales tax remittance works in the US. It's Seller Central settings, tax settings. And Amazon basically automatically remits sales tax in the US for you. You don't really have to do much. There are some states with no facilitator laws. Not going to get into it in this video, but for those, you must put in your own tax ID for that state to collect tax. Again, not going to get into US tax stuff here, but just know that Amazon does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And there's Nexus tax rules that that are in place to remit tax on your behalf at the state level. But in Canada, there's a lot of self-selected options where you can actually dictate via Amazon how those taxes are collected. In Canada, you're going to need that business number, which is similar to an EIN in the US. You're going to need an import-export number for customs imports, and you're going to need that GST HST number for sales tax. Most of that's going to come from the RC1 form, and then the partners that we recommend for importing into Canada are going to help you with the import-export number. But this is the setup that you're going to need. Now, this is really, really important. And again, my advice, not legal or professional advice in terms of how you want to set up your Amazon.ca tax settings within Seller Central Canada. So you're going to want to log into your Seller Central Canada account. You're going to go to that settings. It's like the gearbox in the top right. Currently, you drop down to tax settings. This is the screen that you're going to see. Now, by default, you're not going to have any GST HST registration number entered here. And basically what it means is until you upload that number, Amazon's automatically going to collect and deduct the GST that they've taken from customers purchasing your products from your payouts. So in that way, you're completely above board. You could actually operate in Canada without this number and without this setting taking place. But there's a lot of advantages to actually importing your number here, which we're going to go into those reasons why, as well as some risks that you need to be aware of. But where the AHST GST number is inputted, Amazon will not collect taxes on your behalf. So they're going to take the sales from a customer and the GST is going to be included in that. They're going to deposit all that money in your account. But you're responsible for paying the government once you put that thing in place. And then BC, Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan are not on the federal system. So you got to speak to a tax professional. This is really related to people that live in Canada, have a Canadian entity, and are selling in Canada FBA. So this is really important. You will owe the Canadian government GST, HST for the sales that you generate on Amazon.ca, regardless if Amazon collects this or not. But it's critical that you set up and input your HST, GST number in your tax setting prior to doing FBA sales. Now here's how the Canadian tax disbursement works within Canada. If you've uploaded that number in that field that we just talked about, Amazon will automatically collect this tax at sale. So it's not going to impact your list price. So it'd be, say, $50 list price. They're going to automatically collect the GST. And then when your funds are dispersed via Amazon's regular process, all that money less any Amazon fees that they deduct, etc., are going to be actually put into your account, including that GST that they've collected. So this is where you've got a decision. One, you can set it up so Amazon automatically pays the tax to the government versus dispersing it to you. So the pro of this is you don't got to think about it. You don't got to worry about Canadian taxes. You don't got to worry about filing things. But the con is that if you don't do the deductions, it's not optimal for cash flow, and you're likely going to pay more in tax than if you managed it yourself. So the second option is to set it so Amazon disperses the taxes collected, those GST taxes collected when somebody purchases your product, and then you file with the Canadian government at the end of the year. So the pro of this is that you basically maximize your cash flow first. So again, you're going to get all that GST that a customer pays that's going to get dispersed to you. And you may be 12 months from when you actually need to pay that bill to Canada. So you've optimized your cash flow. You also have deductions. So anytime you import product into Canada and say pay duties, things like that, you can deduct that from the GST that you owe. So once you set it up like this versus Amazon doing it automatically, you're typically going to pay way less in the GST taxes. But the con is that you must be aware that you do have a bill at the end of the year. So you might have been humming along, getting all this money, disbursements from Amazon, and then, oh crap, I owe 10 grand or whatever the number is at the end of the year. So you've got to account for that because you will need to pay it. So in terms of deductions, any GST, HST that you paid to import goods can be deducted from the GST, HST owed to the government. So say you've got an invoice value of $1,000 and you paid, say, $500 on GST for that import, that $500 can be deducted from whatever's owed at the end of the year. And this is based on a COGS declared value. So this isn't your list price that you're going to be able to deduct. Again, using our import partners, they can help you navigate what you actually paid, what the COGS value was, etc. So let's say that you imported $10,000 worth of commercial value goods and you paid $500 on GST at import. This can be deducted by what you owe for the government at the end of the year. So here's an example. So let's say that through all of your sales in Canada, on Amazon, you had $10,000 that came to you from GST paid by customers. That would be what you owe the government if you did the automatic setup. But if you do this filing manually and do it at the end of the year, let's say that you had $1,000 in any import GST that you paid, you can deduct that from the $10,000 owed. And let's say that you had GST on the fulfillment. So Amazon's going to charge you fulfillment fees, which you have to pay GST on. You can also deduct that amount from the total amount owed. So in this example, you take the 10,000 that was collected from customers, you deduct 1,000 from imports, you deduct say 750 from the GST paid on FBA fulfillment. So you'd actually owe 8,250 at the end of the year. So there's those input credits that also come into play in the calculation of what you owe at the end of the year. Again, this is just a high level idea that what we recommend is that you put in your number and that you actually pay it at the end of the year. You can make that decision on your own. Regardless, you will need to file and pay for taxes. We recommend KB Financial Solutions. This is a Canadian accountancy. Lucas Simon is our contact there. I'm going to leave his information here as well as down below. If you want to manage your import fees, your GST filings, all that stuff, I'm going to leave that partner down below. We recommend these guys. They've been great with us. All right, so this next module is all about the shipping and logistics part of the equation. I know this is not what we wanted to do when we were building cool e-commerce businesses, but it's a necessary evil and certainly an important piece of the puzzle with selling in Amazon.ca. So we're going to kick things off by just going through how to ship to Canada and what the actual structure is that we use within our business. You basically have a decision. Do you want to ship the product directly into Canada from your manufacturer? Or do you want to use an existing pool of inventory in the US and then truck that up and import it into Canada? Couple options, each with pros and cons. We're going to break down each as well as what we do. So to kick things off, one approach is that you have your products manufactured likely in China. You ship them to the US, which is what most of us would do if we're already selling in the US, and then taking that existing pool of inventory and shipping it into Canada. You're typically going to want to at least start here because you likely don't have enough volume or even storage capacity in Amazon.ca to actually fulfill. But even long term, this may just be the best way to operate for your business. In fact, today in 95% of the cases, our inventory is actually going to flow through this process from the US to Canada. So in this situation, you basically have your products made in China, you ship them to the US, and you're going to pay a tariff on that using the HTS code for the US, which if it's a Trump tariff might be even 25%. Then you're going to take that product from typically your 3PL in the US, and you're going to either via UPS in single boxes or in truckloads, basically truck that up over the border, import it into Canada, pay Canadian duties, and then get it into an Amazon warehouse. Now, one key thing here is there is an option for a duty drawback, which we're going to get into some of the high level of that in this course. But basically what that means is if you import goods from, say, China into the US, they're never sold in the US, and then they go to another country like Canada, whatever duties you paid on that import into the US, you can actually file to have that returned to you because it wasn't sold in the US. So it's not a completely lost thing, but it's definitely an additional hurdle logistically or financially to take into account. So the pros of this is it's basically the exact same supply chain. You don't need to have new shipments going to Canada from China. Everything is kind of within one pool of inventory in the US. It's the easiest and quickest to implement. It's good with smaller volumes or inventory limits in Canada, which prevent you from sending a lot of inventory into Canada directly. And it's the same warehousing, which tends to be significantly cheaper than it would be in Canada, even with the additional transport into Canada. But there's obviously cons. You've got some additional ground freight into Canada that you may need to account for. You've got additional customs checkpoints. You have to do customs into the US and you got to do customs into Canada. And there's obviously some timeline delays there. You may have higher duties if you don't do the duty drawback, and then it's going to take longer just because you've got some additional steps in the process. Alternatively, you could go from your manufacturer, say in China, directly into Canada, which tend to make sense if you're sending full container loads, if you've got a good warehousing network in Canada already, if you're pumping a decent amount of volume and have inventory limits that support that. In this scenario, you basically just pay the HS tariff amount from your country of origin into Canada, which tends to be quite low, 0 to 3% in most cases. And then because there's only one port in Canada, which is in Vancouver, which is the far west coast, just above Seattle, you've got to then take that goods from BC or British Columbia and put it into different Amazon warehouses depending on your shipping plan. So there can be some significant distance and cost to get it over to the east coast of Canada. Or alternatively, you have a 3PL warehouse somewhere in Canada, maybe multiple places in Canada that you basically stage there, and then you trickle that inventory into Amazon as needed. So the pros of this is obviously lower duties because you're not going through the US first. Even if you do duty drawbacks, it can be just a pain in the butt to do that. You've got less steps in the process and it's less time into Amazon. The cons of this, though, is that you've only got that one port in Vancouver, so there can be significant trucking costs to get it across Canada. You've got typically higher 3PL costs, both in terms of storage, check-in, check-out, pick, pack, ship fees. They're just a lot more expensive. Most of the warehouses in Canada also require like a $750 a month minimum spend. So if you're not pushing a lot of volume, it may be very punitive to use 3PL warehouses in Canada. And then you typically have higher ocean rates. Like the ocean rate from Shenzhen or Shanghai to the Long Beach port is significantly less in most cases than going to Vancouver. Just because there's less traffic to Vancouver, you're going to pay up because of that supply-demand dynamic. So this is basically how we operate. We basically have our goods made in China. Same package and everything for the US and Canada because it's the same FN SKU, it's the same UPC, we don't need any new packaging. And then we basically ship those goods directly to the US, typically via ocean. We then have US duties paid on those goods, depending on what the HTS code is. And then we fill both of our US orders into Amazon warehouses in US, as well as the Canadian warehouses. And we'll do that through our 3PL. And we're going to get into the partner that we use in case you want to use them too. And then basically we ship it from the US into Canada. We pay duties on the Canadian goods to import them. And then we usually go via either SPD, like for single boxes, we'll use UPS into Canada, or we'll use a trucking line if we're shipping a larger amount of goods or palletized goods. We're going to get into all the partner network here at the end. So the pros of this are it's the same inventory pool. So when I'm managing inventory, it's a single warehouse. It's not one in Canada, one here, which is good because sometimes you may need goods in the US, but if you have a whack load of inventory in Canada that's waiting to get sold, it's hard to ship that back into the US. So it's the same pool of inventory that simplifies things, less ocean freight costs, lower 3PL costs for sure, and then lower ocean. Now the cons is that you may have higher tariffs if you don't do the duty drawback. There's additional steps and time just to kind of coordinate all of the freight because you've got to go through the Canadian port, so there's an additional customs checkpoint, and then you've got just some additional time included there as well. But this is the approach I definitely recommend you start with. It's the approach that we still use today, and I think it makes the most sense from a convenience, operational flexibility, inventory management, and frankly cost standpoint as well. So here are all the key partners. Right now we've tested a number of different freight forwarders on ocean. We still use them a lot today, but we've really honed in on guided imports. We've been really happy with their rates and how they operate. So whether you're shipping to Canada from China or to the US via ocean, guided imports is who we use. From a 3PL standpoint, we use Tactical Logistics in the US. I'm going to include a contact for them. If you want an Amazon-based 3PL, AMZ Prep comes highly recommended. I've never used them. We evaluated them. We ended up not going with them because they had like a $750 a month minimum when we first started, and it just didn't make sense. And we just really liked the US to Canada dynamic. It was just easier for us to manage, but those are 2 3PLs in each country you can check out. In terms of SBD, so if you're shipping like single cartons or a handful of boxes, we use Frisbee to basically go from the US to Canada for that. They use UPS. They manage all the import-export stuff. We're good to go there. If we're trucking goods via LTL or FTL, we use CSA Transportation. It's difficult to find folks that do this. We've kind of racked our brains on this, tested a bunch of stuff. Again, this course is worth its weight in gold. Just if you use CSA Transportation, it's going to save you a lot of cost, time, and money. And then in those cases, we use Clear It to manage the customs import into Canada from the US. And if you just in general have questions about your HS code in Canada or import stuff, Clear It is who we recommend. So those partners will be down below, but that is basically how we manage the inventory flow to Canada. So after you've submitted your RC1 form, again, it's going to take roughly 30 to 60 days, kind of depends on how quickly the Canadian government turns it over. But once that's been processed, they're going to reach back out typically via mail or other method how you prescribed in your form. And they're going to actually say, hey, yes, here is your HST GST number, which basically enables you to formally be in their tax system for GST. Once that takes place, you now have a decision. You've activated all your offers that you could or wanted to via the NARF program. You've been selling via remote fulfillment. Now you can say, hey, here are the SKUs or the products that I actually want to ship into Amazon FBA and physically store in Canada so that I can start selling. Again, when you have those products physically there, you typically have a higher conversion rate because you have Prime eligible products. The customers aren't paying those additional shipping and duties like they would via the NARF program. You can really hammer hard on pay-per-click. They can do a lot of things that basically make it selling like in the US. So we're now going to go over when you decide to make that decision for one, some, or all of your products to ship them into Canada via FBA, how to go about doing that. So the first and important step is if you recall from the NARF video setup, and again, rewatch this and look at that SOP if you haven't, what you need to do before you can ship the inventory into FBA is you've actually got to turn off the NARF program for that product. Go through that exact same process, download the report, etc. But what you're going to want to do in that column F where it's yes, no on the remote fulfillment is you're going to want to change it from yes to no or blank to no. And then you re-upload that file. That basically tells Amazon, hey, this offer, this product, I no longer want to be in the NARF program. Once you've done that, you now have the ability to actually ship in fulfillment orders into Amazon. One of the drawbacks during this period is that up until the point that your product is shipped and received into an Amazon Canada warehouse, customers basically can't buy it via NARF and they can't buy it via FBA because the inventory is not in there. So you may see a lag of 2 to 3 weeks in sales while this transition takes place. But step one is to deactivate or put no on the column for NARF, re-upload that file so it's no longer in the NARF program. But once you've got that done, setting up a shipment is literally the same as the US. So you use the same workflow. The only difference is some of the transportation nuances. If you're going to be shipping from the US into Canada, takes a little bit more navigating, which we're going to get into in this video. So our personal process, and again, we're going to get into this more in the logistics video, is we actually ship our Canadian FBA product from our US inventory. So there's a bunch of ways that we do that. One is if it's just single boxes or master cartons, we ship via UPS. You can set up your own UPS account and do this, but we use our partner Frisbee for this. So we basically get quotes from them. We say, hey, here's the box dimensions. We're sending this many boxes into Canada. Here's where it's going in Canada. We need a quote from our address here in, say, our 3PL in California. They quote it out. They work it out. They manage all the logistics of that booking, and then they get back to us with the price. So Frisbee is a partner that we use for our basically individual SPD shipments from the US to Canada. Another method that we use if we're shipping either pallets or lots of products is using LTL or even full truckload services. Company we use for this is CSA Transportation. I'm telling you guys, the price of this course you're going to pay for multiple factors over if you use this method. Getting truckloads into Canada crossing the border can be a pain in the ass. We've tried a lot of different partners that are a headache to work with. CSA Transportation is a golden gem and worth its weight in gold just by buying this course. So if you're going to be shipping pallets, multiple boxes that don't make sense via UPS from the US to Canada, use CSA Transportation. Then the other option is that you basically have product at a Canadian 3PL. And you can ship those in using UPS partner carriers in Canada, which is the same as booking a UPS shipment from your Seller Central account. So if you've got inventory in Canada, you can also do SBD UPS using that flow there. So basically to set up a shipment, again, very similar to the US, you're just going to want to log into Seller Central. You're going to actually want to be in your Canadian Seller Central account. Click that 3-bar menu in the top left. You're going to want to go down to Manage FBA Inventory, and then it's going to pull all of your Amazon FBA inventory here that's in Canada. Find the one that you want to ship in, and you're going to want to go to that Edit drop-down button, and then just go to Send Replenish Inventory. Once you do that, it's going to pull up that product. If this is the first time you're shipping a product in, highly recommend that you set up a shipping template. This is something that you have to do once per product, and then it's basically established. So you set the master carton dimensions, quantity, and weight for a particular product, and then Amazon knows anytime you want to ship cartons in moving forward, it's got that template set up. So to do that, you're just going to want to click on that little edit button. The first time it's going to pull up a menu like this. You just select case pack, however many units are in your master carton, the dimensions in metric. Just go to Google to convert inches to centimeters if you need to, and then the box weight's going to be in kilograms. You can again save this template. Anytime you ship this product again, it's going to have this template, so you only need to do it once. Then you just select the number of boxes or cartons that you want to ship in and then hit ready to send. Now, one thing here, one of the downsides when you first flip over to Amazon FBA is just like the US, there's going to be inventory limits, and they tend to be quite low when you first start shipping product to Canada FBA. So your limit may be 50 units, it may be 100, maybe really small. So your first couple shipments via FBA into Canada until you start to get sales volume via Canada FBA may require that you do custom smaller master cartons. So let's say that you've got a master carton with 100 units and you go here to this drop down menu and see that your restock limit limit is 50, guess what? You're going to have to reduce the number of units that you send in. Same thing applies if you're looking to send in 3, 4, 5 products initially into Amazon, Canada FBA. You may only be able to do a handful of SKUs until you get those inventory limits up. So you may want to check that drop down at the bottom just to see what your inventory limits are, and you may send some partial cartons initially. From there, it's again same as the US. You basically set the date that you want to ship the product, and then you can select via SPD or LTL. Again, if you're shipping from the US, which is how we do it and how I recommend most people do it, you can use Frisbee for getting your quote on SPD, or you can use CSA transportation on the LTL. Once you use those services, though, they will give you numbers, tracking numbers, invoices, things like that are required here. You're going to need to upload that documentation here. If you're shipping Canada to Canada, so if the product's already in Canada and you're just shipping it to a Canadian warehouse, Amazon FBA warehouse, you can use Amazon's partner carrier for SPD, in which case it's all automated and you can print the labels out right from this workflow. The other thing here is that you may want to change your address. So the shipment's going to default typically to wherever you've typically been shipping in the US. You can just go to view, edit that, and then just go to ship from another address, and you can edit that address as needed. So if you end up standing up a Canadian 3PL or it's coming from a different location, you can edit that address, and it's obviously going to change the dynamics there. So that is how you set up and ship an FBA shipment into Canada. All right, so we've talked through the process on how you can ship your goods from your manufacturer, likely in China, into the US and then into Canada, which is what we do. Again, one of the major drawbacks of this is that you're actually going to be paying US-based duties to get those products into the US. You're going to store them in some facility in the US and then trickle inventory into Canada and then pay customs again into Canada. Now, Canada has really low import duties, typically 0 to 3%, so that's the good news. The bad news is that you might have paid upwards of 25% plus to get your goods into the US. Now, if your import duties are really low, like 0 to 3% in the US, you may just not want to go through the hassle of clawing back those duties using a process called duty drawbacks. But if you've been hit with the Trump tariff or there's a more punitive tariff of 20% plus, you might have some meaningful dollars that you may actually want to get back. So there's a process called duty drawbacks. And what that basically means is, let's say that you imported goods at a commercial value of $10,000. Let's say that you had a Trump tariff of 25% and you paid the US duties on that of $2,500. Because you did not sell those goods in the US, let's say you took all 10,000 of those dollars and you imported them into Canada, you could actually recoup that $2,500 in duties paid based on the invoice value and based on the value of the duties that you paid. Now, the process goes through something called the ACE portal. It's pretty complicated, not going to get into a tutorial here, but your freight forwarder should know how and should be able to facilitate this for you. Also included those contacts down below of freight forwarders that we use that could help you out, in addition to Clear It Canada, who may also be able to help you claw back those duties. So if you've got a meaningful amount of duties that you've paid on goods that you then later sent into Canada, speak with your freight forwarder, ask them if they can help you with the duty drawback process, and they can walk you through those steps to recoup those US duties paid. So a really quick video here because we covered it in the summary video before, but just wanted to dive in specifically on the warehousing or 3PL strategies that you may want to deploy. The first of which is if you actually want to house inventory in Canada and drip feed that into Amazon.ca for your FBA fulfillment, you can use a Canadian 3PL. Pros of this is that you can ship ocean directly into Canada and avoid that import into the US. You have lower duties as a result of that typically. You've got also the ability to do omni-channel fulfillment. So if you wanted to turn on a Shopify site, or if you're running paid ads to your Shopify site, or if you've got retail partners in Canada, etc., it's a lot more difficult to send individual unit orders from the US into Canada. It's just a headache. But if you've got a Canadian warehouse, that makes that process a lot more fluid. The other thing is for returns management. If you don't have this set up in Canada or a returns partner, typically you're just going to dispose of any inventory that's returned and you can't recoup any of those costs. You can't sell it on eBay. You can't refurbish it, etc. So having a warehouse in Canada enables you to do that. Some of the cons though, much higher costs. It's typically $30 per pallet per month in Canada, which is quite a bit higher than the US. You've got expensive ground freight if it's West Coast based, which a lot of the 3PLs are. And then again, all goods from China go in through Vancouver. So regardless if even you got an East Coast warehouse, it's still got to get trucked from British Columbia all the way across the country to that warehouse. Now, a partner that we've got here is AMZ Prep. I haven't personally used them because we haven't warehoused in Canada, but they come recommended in the Amazon seller community as one of the best in Canada. Now, the other approach, which we talked about too, and how we use this, is using a US-based 3PL. Pros are you've got lower cost, you've got the same inventory pool, lower ocean freight because you're coming into the US, and frankly, it's just easier, less headaches, less operational considerations. The cons of that is you do have more operational steps because you've got to truck it through Canada, pay Canadian imports and US imports. You've got more expensive ground freight in some cases, depending on where it's going in Canada. You've got no omni-channel fulfillment, so you can't do the Shopify stuff. You can't do retailer shipments. And then the returns management basically is out the equation because you don't have a physical location in Canada to manage returns. But the partner we use for that is Tactical Logistics. They're amazing. They're based in California. Offices are in New Jersey. They're growing like a weed, and we've had a really positive experience with them.